Maybe each human being lives in a unique world, a private world different from those inhabited and experienced by all other humans. If reality differs from person to person, can we speak of reality singular, or shouldn't we really be talking about plural realities? And if there are plural realities, are some more true, more real than others? Wise words from the subject of today's conversation, the late great science fiction author Philip K. Dick. What Lies Beyond with your host Matt Coburn. Conversations on consciousness science, the paranormal, and the post-material future. This podcast accompanies the What Lies Beyond book by Matt Coburn, now available for purchase on Amazon and other retail outlets. Visit us and subscribe on whatliesbeyond.substack.com. Today I have a dialogue with returning guest Anthony Peake. Anthony is a writer who deals with borderline areas of human consciousness. His first book, Is There Life After Death?, was published by Arcturus Books in 2006. It detailed Anthony's cheating the ferryman hypothesis, which argues that we experience our lives over and over again, like the movie Groundhog Day. This book has now sold over 60,000 copies worldwide and has been translated into various foreign language editions. In 2013, Anthony published a book on the science fiction writer Philip K. Dick, also known as PKD. Anthony sees many intriguing parallels between Philip K. Dick's ideas and his own. So in today's feature-length dialogue, we take a deep dive into the life and literary career of PKD. We discuss the weird experiences that inspired much of that fiction. And we attempt to draw out the significance of PKD's work for our understanding of consciousness, reality, and time. Okay, so I'm here with Anthony Peake, and we're going to have what's hopefully going to be a really fascinating dialogue on the late great science fiction author Philip K. Dick. But just to start, I thought I'd tell people how I got introduced to PKD's work. So I grew up in the 1980s, and Blade Runner was a really big phenomenon, I think. It took a while to take off after its release in 1982. But there was a book in our school library that was a tie-in to the Blade Runner movie called Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? And I have to admit, I did read that one, but I wasn't quite ready for it. So that novel, which was written by Phil Dick in, I think, 1967, is a very crucial one, which concerns sort of androids and humans and what's the difference between the two. But it was really only at university when I started getting more into Phil Dick and understanding just how profoundly important a writer he actually was. So the first novel I think I read properly was one called The World Jones Made, which was about this precognitive man who can see 1 year into the future, who ends up ruling the world. And of course it backfires on him horribly in a way which I'm not going to spoil for people who'd like to read it. But the novel that really had an impact on me, I actually read in Berkeley, California, where Phil Dick spent a good portion of his life. And it was a kind of a pilgrimage for me because at the time I was also reading the works of Robert Anton Wilson, particularly the Schrodinger's cat. And he and Philip K. Dick had some very convergent ideas and actually, it turns out, experiences on altered states of consciousness, alternate realities, all of that kind of thing. And so the book that I happened to take along with me was Valis, which was one of Phil Dick's last novels, not the last one, but one of the later ones. I think it was it 1982, that one, or 1981? One of the late ones, anyway. But that was totally different from the earlier ones that I'd read because it was very personal and it was a kind of semi-fictionalized account of a very strange experience he had that I'm sure we can discuss. And after that, I was completely hooked and I just got as much of his material as I could and just read it voraciously. And I think that's where it began, really. So for a long time, I've been very keen to discuss this further with anyone who's just as fanatically interested in Philip K. Dick as I am. So Anthony, how was it? What was your introduction to Philip K. Dick, and how did you get into his work?
Very interesting, actually. And thank you for that background story, Matt, by the way, because I agree with you totally about the world Jones made and how strange that was. And of course, Valis as a novel is extraordinary because for me, Valis there's so many kind of clever in-jokes in that novel as well, like the character Horselover Fat, which is one of the other characters. There's a novelist called Philip Dick, who's a science fiction writer, and he also has this very, very weird friend called Horselover Fat. And you quickly realize, if you are a linguist and know about foreign languages, very quickly you realize that Horselover Fat is just a play on words to do with Philip K. Dick, because of course Phil Hippus is Greek for horse lover and Dick is German for fat. So you go, oh, very, very clever. And they have these wonderful characters, don't they? Like there's Eric Lampton, who is the English rock star. And Lampton, again, is curious because you think he's meaning Eric Clapton, whereas in point of fact, he means David Bowie. So it gets even cleverer. But we can talk about that book later. But I very much got into Philip K. Dick probably in the mid-1960s. And at that time, like a lot of teenagers, I became interested in science fiction. And I was always fascinated by the weird names that American science fiction writers had. They were never called just Fred Brown or George, we had John Wyndham, and H.G. Wells, whereas they had Murray Leinster and A.E. Van Voigt and people like that. And Philip K. Dick was one of the names that was in that worldview. And when I used to read the science fiction books and short stories, I always found I enjoyed the others, but Philip K. Dick I never really got. He was different. Whereas, I mean, I love people like Ray Bradbury and the kind of the magical feel that Bradbury put in his novels. But Philip K. Dick was different. His novels were somehow cleverer, more intellectual. There were more references to other writers and ideas. And my teenage mind just wasn't developed enough for it. And it was only when I got into my 20s and by a circuitous route, I got back to Philip K. Dick via the novels of Philip Jose Farmer, who wrote an incredible thing called The River World. And through Jose Farmer, I then got to Ursula Le Guin. And from there, it was suddenly then a realization that I need to go back and look at this guy, Philip K. Dick. And I started reading his books. And they stunned me. They absolutely, and immediately, I remember Ursula Le Guin making this famous statement that Philip K. Dick is our own homegrown Jorge Borges. And he was. He had an interesting Latin American name. His work would have been much more popular at the time within intellectual circles, because he was writing like Borges. He was writing magical realism. But his books were not standard science fiction. They dealt with what it is to be human, what it means to be, what is empathy. Like, again, in Do Androids Dream, the religion in there is called Mercerism. which doesn't feature in the movie, but it's a central theme, is the idea of we can only really be fully human if we appreciate the position of other people within the world. We empathize with them. And there's a central the person that founds Mercerism, a guy called Mercer, is continually on TV being shown, being people throwing stones at him, and you feel his pain.
Yeah.
And this I thought was brilliant. And I then delighted when he became more famous towards his later years. But really, what really brought me round to him was when I wrote my book, The Daemon, A Guide to Your Extraordinary Secret Selfhood. And when I was writing it, for some reason, my daemon, probably my higher self, for want of a better term, focused me back on the writings of Philip K. Dick for some curious reason. And I suddenly realised that Dick was writing an awful lot of the themes that really fascinated me. The things that I'd been interested in. He'd already got there. He'd already pursued it, but in a much more artistic way rather than scientific way that I try to do these. But I then had a chapter at the end of that book. The final chapter is called The Owl in Daylight, and it is about Philip K. Dick. And what then happened was that I was then doing, and what really made me realise that I had to do something about the Philip K. Dick work was I was giving a talk at Bolton Central Library in Lancashire. And Bolton Central Library is really interesting in that it's a beautiful Victorian building. And at the back of it, there's this theatre. It's not just a library. They have a theatre in the back. It's like a very high-angled university lecture theatre, almost. So I'm giving a talk, and there's about 100 people in there. And as I'm giving a talk, I get to the end, and I'm talking about the book, The Daemon, and I get to the end, and I have a series of photographs on a PowerPoint of showing Philip K. Dick and his novels. And as I did that, there were a group of people on the extreme right-hand side, of my extreme right-hand side, in the audience started talking to each other and nudging each other and everything. And I thought, this is really ill-mannered of you. You know, this is not really what you should be doing. And it distracted me for a second. And then I went back to the presentation. And then when I finished the presentation, the guys came down to me, there were 4 or 5 guys. And one of them came over to me and he said, "We are so excited about meeting you." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Well, it's really quite weird." Because he said, I dropped off a book in this library about a week ago. And he said, "I've got it out again to show you." And it was literally one of the covers. I'd put 3 books up, 2 of Philip K. Dick's books. And it was the exact edition of a particular novel by Philip K. Dick, which one, it escapes me, I can't remember which one it was now. And he said, and when I came into the library, lo and behold, as I'm walking out, there's a poster. And the poster's saying, Anthony Peake will be doing a talk here in a week or two's time. And he said, and I'm a great fan of your work. And I love your book, Is There Life After Death? And I got a few friends together. I said, this guy's really interesting. He's doing some really interesting stuff. And he said, so they all come along. We're all sitting up there. And you go on about near-death experiences and everything else. And then he said, suddenly, out of the blue, you start talking about Philip K. Dick. And suddenly you have the picture of the book. And he said, because we as a group are interested in synchronicities anyway. And we thought, this is a weird synchronicity. And then out of the blue, he said, and of course you know that Philip K. Dick predicted you, don't you? And I went, no. He says, well, you're not aware of this. And I said, no, I've only read a few of his books. I'm not a great expert on Philip K. Dick. I'm interested in his ideas, but nothing more. And he said, so you haven't read Counterclock World then? And I said, no. And he said, oh, you really must. And he said, for instance, we're talking about synchronicities here, but do you know that in the book, there is the idea that time is running backwards? And he said, so you have this theme. It's called I can't remember it's now.
It's the Hobart effect.
Hobart, that's right, thank you. Yeah, the Hobart. Yeah. And the Hobart, time is running backwards and forwards at the same time. And there is a character in the book who is a religious leader who has ideas about what happens when we die and the way the Hobart phase can be used to come up with a model of life after death. And he said, so in Philip K. Dick's book, he has a guy that writes a book about time and about what happens to human consciousness at the point of death. And he turned around and he said, so what name do you think he could have called him? And I said, I've no idea. And he said, well, remember, Phil used to play around with strange names and everything, but he could have called him any name under the sun. And I said, yeah. And he said, he called him Anarch Peake. And I went, you're kidding me. And he said, no. He said his real name, the character's real name was Thomas Peake. But because he was a religious leader, he was an anarch. And I thought, well, hold on a minute. It's the first two letters, A-N, of my name, Anthony, and Peake, and it's Peake without an E. And this stunned me. And funnily enough, the guys then became really good friends of mine, and they became part of my group up in the Northwest. And they had a big thing about Seville. The amount of coincidences that happened around Seville was extraordinary. Literally, my wife and I had just come back from Seville a few weeks before, and he said, if I said Seville to you, would it mean anything? And I said, yes, we've just come back from there. He said, there you go. That's how it works. So I then started researching Philip K. Dick, and just to make a point here at how I think Philip K. Dick may have come across my name, it's completely ridiculous. Just bear with me on this. As you know, Philip K. Dick had a series of experiences called 2374, when he had some very strange experiences, which we might touch upon later. But during this particular period in 1974, he had what he called his Kandinsky dream, where he saw a series of hypnagogic images flashing past his eyes of paintings, and they looked like paintings by Kandinsky and Paul Klee and various other people, which he believed were being projected to him by people in St. Petersburg, or Leningrad as it was, the Hermitage Museum there, because he said they have lots of paintings there. But he also had a series of sequences during that sequence where he saw book covers flying past him. And I just thought for a second, just imagine that one of those book covers was this book cover. And it flashed by him. Now, remember, he talked about the imagery being like Kandinsky. Now, if you look at the book cover here, this is, if you know the art of Kandinsky and Paul Klee, it's the same kind of colouring scheme. It's the same kind of imagery that that Kandinsky would paint. So I thought for a second, imagine that one of the books was my book that flashed past him. And as it flashed past him, he saw the name in a split second, but he couldn't catch it all. So he got the A-N and the P-E-A-K. And then, created then, and the interesting thing is he would have back created that character, because of course Phil believed that an awful lot of the plots of his novels were actually his future memories, and he'd have events in his future which his previous self in the past would then have in a dream, and they'd create a novel based upon it, and we can touch upon that a little bit as well. But that's how I got into Philip K. Dick anyway.
There's such a lot to unpick there. I think the first comment I'd make is that I think this has happened to me, and I suspect other people, is that when you start engaging with Phil Dick's material, you start feeling sometimes as if you're actually living within a Philip K. Dick novel yourself. I'm sort of just thinking back to reading Valis when I was actually at the places he was talking about. So not just Berkeley, but also San Francisco, Golden Gate Bridge, Oakland, all of that. And it's very strange how fiction and reality just seem to converge at points. And the second thing is, it's to answer the question that some regular listeners might be asking, which is why on earth are we talking about a science fiction writer in a podcast that's primarily sort of about issues in consciousness? And I think we've begun to answer that question, because one of the comments that I sent to Anthony when I was reading his book, but it's really throughout Phil Dick's work too, is how central the theme of consciousness and time is in his work. And it over and over again. So I'm just off the top of my head, we've got major novels like Martian Time Slip, Counterclock World, which you mentioned, which is a very strange novel. It begins with two workers waiting for an old lady to come back from the grave because everything is working backwards. And it's but time and consciousness, and also these horrible no time place called the Tomb World, which
Mm.
he links that in with sort of severe mental illness like schizophrenia, and that's in Martian Time Slip 2. And is there a particular work of his though, Anthony, that leaps out for you, or what are your standout books
Well,
for
very much
Dick?
interesting your reference there to the description of the opening section there, because that immediately reminds me of showing just how probably literary Philip K. Dick was in his references, because I know that Philip K. Dick was very interested in the writings of James Joyce and the guy that wrote Samuel Beckett, Waiting for
Yep.
Godot. And I don't know if you recall, but there is a line in Waiting for Godot where the characters, Beckett is trying to explain the circularity of time. Now, for instance, we know that in Waiting for Godot, there are 3 acts, and each one is virtually identical, as if they're reliving again with slightly different characters, and the roles change slightly. But it's the idea of, like, when we both met recently at the J.B. Priestley thing, Priestley's ideas again of the way time can be circular. And the idea is that the characters are waiting for this person that never turns up. But there's one line in the second where they turn around, and one of the characters turns around and said, it's like giving birth astride a grave. And it's again the idea of the circularity of you give birth into a grave, which is exactly what Phil was describing in that novel. He was saying that this is the same thing. And that's what I love about his work. The references are there. The depth of his research is extraordinary. But I think in many ways, the novels, I love many of his novels for different reasons. But I think I agree with you. I think that the top 2 is probably Ubik and
Yes.
Valis. And I particularly like Ubik because in Ubik, he's playing with reality. He's playing with consciousness. What do we know can be real? What is real? What isn't real? And in Ubik, one of the main characters has been assassinated on the moon, and he's dead. But he's not really dead. He's stuck in a thing Philip K. Dick calls half-life, which is that point between life and death, which is like the tomb world. So it's exactly the same. It's like the argument of the Bardo state in Tibetan Buddhism. So it's this idea that there is this place between lives, or between life and proper death, that you're in a timeless place, what Philip K. Dick called orthogonal time. It's a time runs, from in a line, but there's a time that's at right angles to this time, and this time is timeless. It's the time of, and again, it was something I noticed recently about Philip K. Dick's writing. In the novel, and I need to say this because while it's in my head, but in his novel that he never finished when he died in 1982, but there was a novel he was writing called The Owl in Daylight. And if you read his exegesis, and if you read his collection of letters, you can pull together from the exegesis and from the letters what the basic plot line would have been. There were letters he wrote to people describing the plot line. And I know that Tessa Dick wrote her own version of this as well. Tessa was his last wife. And in it, they have a sequence where the central character is a scientist who has suffered from amnesis, that is, forgetting. And again, Phil was referencing in the ancient Greeks and the Platonic idea of you forget who you are. And he's living in a simulation. And he's become a young boy who's lost in a theme park, an amusement arcade. And he's a young lad, but he's really a grown-up scientist. And when he's wandering around in this place, he keeps hearing this voice talking to him. And it's a female voice, which Phil we can touch upon because Phil was fascinated by a voice he used to hear he called AI, which we'll come on to later. So he's already writing. This is the thing about Philip K. Dick. His novels are writing about his life. These are not fiction. He is using fiction to explain the things that are happening to him. And in it, this AI voice, which he identifies with the Shekinah, which is the female driving principle of the universe, according to the Kabbalah. And so this is the concept of the Shekinah. And this voice is supposedly the Shekinah. But this voice guides him to go to live in Berkeley and become a science fiction writer. So clearly within this illusionary universe, this AI world, this simulation that the main character is living in, there's a voice outside of it. Now that reminded me of the reversal of what happens in Interstellar, the movie. Because you remember in Interstellar, because you discover in Philip K. Dick's book that the voice is in fact his own daughter. The character's daughter is talking to him from outside the simulation to guide him through. Now, in the movie Interstellar, and I'm sure that Christopher Nolan must have used this trope, it's too similar. Because do you remember in Interstellar, you have the central character trying to communicate with his daughter in the past.
Through the Tesseract.
Through the Tesseract.
He falls through the black hole, doesn't he? And then he arrives in this weird sort of, it's kind of like square space, but it's like his life or the past.
That's right.
You know,
he sees his daughter's life from the position of the fifth dimension, looking into the 4 dimensions of space and time. And if you're in the 5th dimension, all time is simultaneous. So there is no time. Everything is happening now. So you can see everything from a viewpoint as if you're looking down at it. And he's doing that. And that's why you have the fantastic Tesseract sequence where Nolan is trying to get across the idea of what the world would look like from the viewpoint of it being in the 5th dimension. And he communicates with her, as remember the fascinating bit where he pushes the book from the bookcase. And the book falls at a particular moment. Now, again, a Tesseract, even called a Tesseract sequence quite intriguingly because of a Tesseract. A Tesseract is a hypercube. So the idea is if you have you start with a point and then you draw a line, that's 1 dimension. Then if you draw at right angles to that, another line, you end up with a square, which is 2 dimensions. Then if you draw right angles from the 4 corners of the square, you get a cube, which is then 3 dimensions. But then if you then go out of those dimensions and you assume each corner of the cube is expanded outwards, you get what's called a hypercube mathematically. And this is and it's called a tesseract. And this is the idea he's getting forward. So to me, Phil was way ahead of his time, and there's this kind of genuflections. And again, I'm reminded here again of another movie that uses the same technique, is Vanilla Sky. And in Vanilla Sky, you have the central character, David Ames, who's played by Tom Cruise. And do you remember there's a bit where he's in the bar and he's living in this simulation. And an entity, an AI entity, is injected into the simulation to talk to him. So again, it's outside 5th dimension into the what I call the Bohemian IMAX. And inside, the character speaks to him in a bar, do you remember? And he's trying to explain to him that he's already dying and he's in this bardo state. And Tom Cruise turns around, "Oh, shut the F up." And as he does so, everybody freezes. And again, it's so Phil Dickian. It again shows that Philip K. Dick's cleverness was brilliant. So going back, I went wow into far more ahead than I did. But in Valis, in Ubik, this character him and his wife are dead, but they're trying to communicate with the people in this universe, this world. And they start to manipulate, this character, the dead character, starts to manipulate things in this world to make the characters realize that they're living in a simulation. And it's really very cleverly done. And Phil's argument all the way along was, throughout his life, that this is a simulation. We don't know what is real or what is not real. And that's the whole central point. It's deeply philosophical. It's coming right back to the ideas of Hume and all the great philosophers. It's extreme subjectivism, extreme solipsism almost, because what do I really know except what my senses tell me?
Yes, exactly. I mean, and again, there's sort of quite a few things to pick up there. But a lot of these themes, though, we mentioned the exegesis, and I think perhaps we need to explain to listeners what that was, because I think I remember reading, actually, I think it was Brian Aldiss was saying that Philip K. Dick's novels are really just one vast, yes, that's it, are really just one vast piece of work. And you do get that impression that you read a novel and then you read 10 novels, or how I think he did about 42, didn't he? But you're dipping into the same sort of universe, and it might be different characters and different worlds, but there are so many persistent themes there. And then there's this sort of huge work that I must admit I've got a copy of the exegesis, but I have struggled with it a bit. I've read the potted summary at the back of Valis, but if you could just explain what that was and how that relates to his wider work, I think it might help people.
Yeah, very much. The exegesis, I have the exegesis in two versions when I did my research. So I have this version, which is the hardback version, but I also have it on Kindle. And it works much better on Kindle because Phil, what it is basically when Phil was living with Tessa, every night he used to write notes. He'd stay up all night writing notes and ideas. And the exegesis is basically when they found all these notes, they put them together into a volume. But there's no linearity to it. It's just ideas. Like I do, I have diaries from the last 30 years. And in the diaries, I just jot down ideas. That day I thought of this thing and that thing. So in many ways, I very much appreciate Phil's mindset. He thinks like I do. In fact, when I was writing the biography, I felt I was becoming him. It was quite disturbing. I felt I was starting to think like him. And I found that quite strange. But you do that when you write a biography, you become the person because you get to know them so well. So with the exegesis, it fizzes with ideas. And when you read the exegesis, as you say, you realize that Phil had themes that came through all of his novels and all of his books. And the best book for that, funnily enough, is this one, written by a guy called Andrew M. Butler.
Okay,
and it's a really thin book, and it's just called Philip K. Dick, The Pocket Essential. And literally it has a short description of each of Phil's novels where he points out and he says what it draws on when he wrote it, the storyline, the recurring characters from other novels that are the same, recurring ideas and references and the subtext. And it's really good because it makes you see the themes run through continually. Now, in the exegesis itself, I mean, for my sins, I had to read it cover to cover as part of my research for the book. So what it did was I had two areas that I don't think any other biographer, I may be wrong, but I don't think any other biographer up until that date anyway, now I wrote this book in 2017 or 2015, is that I had both the exegesis to refer to and also a friend of mine called Buchanan. Oh, I can't think of his first name now, but he is a huge Philip K. Dick fan. Nick Buchanan. And Nick is the editor of a fanzine called PKD Otaku. I don't know if you know about it at all. Okay. And
yes, I have. We can link it.
Okay. He's the editor of that. And he, because of our interest in, and we both lived on the Wirral at that time, so we became really close friends. And he had all of the bound PKD letters, which I could never have afforded to buy, but he had them all. And as I said, about 10 volumes of these, and he sent them me all. So I was in a position I was able to read the novels again, then be able to read the letters from that period and time to know what was in Phil's mind. Because his letters are extraordinary. They're as good as any of his novels. And even again, they tell you so much about the man. And they also tell you a lot of things that he used to exaggerate and tell lies. Because that's one of the major things I discovered of reading the letters and reading his versions of things, that he told fibs about things. He made up things that he said were true. And you can tell from the letters they weren't. Like his Strawberry Fields Forever incident, where he had heard the Beatles telling him, he was listening to the Beatles and he heard the Beatles telling him in the song Strawberry Fields Forever that his son had an inguinal hernia, a birth defect, and that he needed to get him to the hospital quickly. And Phil's version of that is that, yes, he came out of the reverie, grabbed the kid, drove into the hospital. The doctors were amazed that Phil knew that he had an inguinal hernia. And he said, yes, it was something magical that happened. Total nonsense. Absolute nonsense. I know from Tessa that's not how it happened, but nearly all the other biographers take that as granted. You read nowadays any book on Philip K. Dick, they'll tell you that story. If you read the letters, if you do your research rather than just copy what other people have written, which I didn't do, you will discover from the letters that Phil's son was much, much older when he had the inguinal hernia. And it was weeks afterwards. It took weeks for the diagnosis to take place. Tessa told me she took Christopher to the hospital. Phil didn't. He had a fear of driving. So it was Tessa that did all that. So none of that happened as he described it. And in my research, I discovered that Phil makes out that he didn't know where all this knowledge of the inguinal hernia came from. It seemed to download from somewhere. He knew nothing about these things. Utter nonsense. When he was living in Ray's Station, when he was living in Northern California, north of San Francisco, his then wife, Anne, I think it was Anne, or it might have been earlier. It might have been yeah, it was Anne, I think. He injured himself playing tennis, and he had an inguinal hernia. And he had work done on an inguinal hernia. And as Anne said, he read up an awful lot about inguinal hernias. So to him to make out that he knew nothing about it is wrong. And you have to always, with Phil, remember he was a novelist. He was a creator of ideas. He exaggerated and he embroidered. And that has to be taken into account. I don't know how I got off on that tangent now.
I think we were talking about the exegesis, but this is actually a useful segue, because that's part of a sequence of what you would call what's the date? The basically the April 1974 sequence of mystical experience.
Yeah, February 2374. So it was February, March 74.
Yes. So, and that claimed experience is absolutely part of the broader picture, which included things like, him being shot with a beam of pink light that was crammed with information.
That again wasn't the same. Again, it's really quite funny, that one. It didn't remind me to tell you that. It's quite funny from what Tessa told me.
Just briefly, I think this also shows the importance of going back to the primary sources, because I remember last time when we were talking about near-death experiences, there are similar problems with accounts that had just been taken at face value by different writers and regurgitated. Whereas if you actually go back to the original sources, the situation is quite often more complicated, much more compromised than it seems in the final story. But the other thing that I would say, and this particularly comes across reading in your book of his, which is in part a very good biography, but also an analysis of his experiences. He was actually first of all, he was very overworked for about 30 years. To fuel that, he often took handfuls of drugs so he could work through the night, particularly things like amphetamines, but all sorts of things. It was that kind of era in California, I think, where you could just do that kind of with impunity. And as a result, he had a number of health problems like very high blood pressure, and you suspect migraines as well, which I find very plausible.
I do.
But I think we've got to bear in mind that his state of mind in the 60s, 70s and 80s, I mean, he got off the drugs, but he had a history of mental health problems. He was very prone to paranoia, maybe a fantasy-prone personality. I don't think this necessarily negates it. It's just that it adds a layer of complexity and the riddle-like quality of so much of his work, and also another theme which we haven't mentioned, which is deception and self-deception. A central theme in Phil's writing is deception. You don't know. It's like in Ubik, which you talked earlier. What basically happens is a group of people appear in this world which at first seems okay, and then it starts degenerating. So it's like a modern car gets replaced by a Model T, and a computer gets replaced by a typewriter, and it's over and over again you get that same theme, this sort of the self-deception. Or the other one, Time Out of Joint, which is a novel that, like The Truman Show. So in The Truman Show, Jim Carrey is a character who's really in a TV show and in a fake town with fake people. And that's anticipated by Time Out of Joint. And again, I think Hollywood has dined out on Philip K. Dick ideas for a decade.
Totally, without ever acknowledging the fact, isn't it? I mean, I love in Time Out of Joint the bit. I think it's where he picks up a water fountain, and there's a little sign that says "Place water fountain here." You know, and of course, the thing is, in that thing, the character does is it a crossword puzzle or find the alien or something, where he puts X's on a spot the
Yes.
alien is, and he does this regularly, and he keeps winning the prize. And you realise at the end, the twist is that he's living in a simulation because he's a precog, and what the Earth is at war with another alien civilization, and he can predict where the bombs are going to land. But to make his mind clear, he's got to make him like that he's in this fake world. And I think you're right. I mean, he was paranoid, and he was fascinated with simulacra. He was fascinated with the idea of things not being what they look like, and they're being faked in one way or another, and his paranoia, the break-in that happened, where he thought that the bad guys were after him. And I genuinely believe there probably was a degree of that. But going back again to the pink beam issue, where Phil claimed that he was in great pain, he'd had an impacted wisdom tooth, and he sent out for some drugs. And the delivery girl turns up at the door, and as she does so, the sun catches her pendant, and it was a fish sign, the kind of Christian sign. And he said a pink beam came out and hit him in the eyes, and he had this kind of amazing sensation experience or whatever. This is not what Tessa told me. Tessa told me that what happened was there was the knock on the door. Phil goes to the door, and there's the girl in the doorway, and she was quite buxom, and she was wearing a very low, and Phil was ogling her breasts. And as he was ogling her breasts, Tessa appears, spots him ogling her breasts, and he just goes, oh, there's a pink beam that just came out from her pendant. And as Tessa said, she said he might have been, but she said, I think he was just caught out. And she explained to me that, and again, this is the level of research I did for the book to make sure that I was right. Tessa told me that they had a few weeks before, they had been in a bookshop, and they both were quite interested in religion, and Phil was quite an active Episcopalian. And they bought a Christian sticker of, again, the fish symbol, which they had stuck in the doorway of the house. And Tessa said what actually happened was the light hit that and reflected through that, which Phil saw. But I would argue that if Phil had photosensitive migraine, which I have, my migraines can be triggered by things like that. If a light hits me in a certain way, I will go into a kind of almost pre-seizure state. It's called the aura state. And when I'm in the aura state, for me, I start losing my sight. I can't see. Literally, there's a whiteout. It's called the scotoma, and it literally takes over my visual field. So I've only got periphery vision. And I can't drive. I've got to stop and everything else as well. And during that time, I see different colors. I see different lights. I have powerful hypnagogic imagery. That is where I'm somewhere else and I see something else. Almost a sensation of out-of-body experience, and I get powerful déjà vu sensations. All of these things are linked, and I believe this is what was happening with Phil. And when he had the Kandinsky dream that I was talking about earlier, this is a classic hypnagogic imagery. I'll guarantee that most people watching this will have had this experience. You're lying in bed and you're in that liminal sleep to awake state or awake to sleep state. And suddenly you see faces in profile, or you'll suddenly flash and you'll see a scene and you go, where did that come from? And it's in your visual field, and it's as if it's creeping up on you. In other words, with hypnagogic imagery, you have to allow it to develop, because if you put your attention to it, it goes. So you have to almost lure it in. And I know this because one of my associates is a guy called Dr. Andreas Mavromatis. And Andreas wrote the definitive book on hypnagogia called Hypnagogia. Well worth reading. His book is extraordinary, by the way. It's the definitive book on the subject. And I think this is what's happening with Phil. And I think in many ways, this is how Phil anticipated a lot of his plots because he was in a hypnagogic or hypnopompic state. I also am aware that Phil also had something called Alice in Wonderland syndrome. And Alice in Wonderland syndrome is, again, it's linked to migraine. I get it myself. I used to get it as a kid. It's when you're lying in bed and you feel your body is expanding massively, as if you're expanding out to fill the universe. That's called macropsia, technically. But there's the other element, micropsia, where you suddenly feel you're shrinking, which is, of course, where the Alice in Wonderland link goes, where Alice does the drink me and she gets big and she gets small. But this is, again, a classic example of classic migraine. Not standard migraine, by the way. This is classic migraine. That's migraine. I get migraine normally without a headache. I get the aura, but I don't get the headache. And I think Phil had this.
Yes, it sounds very, very likely to me. But again, we've got parallels here with near-death experiences. But hypnagogia, I would link in. I mean, it might sound to listeners that we're proposing a very reductionist and dismissive explanation for his experiences, but actually the opposite is true, because I think what these states can do sometimes is open doorways into, for example, enhanced creativity. And I think, whatever states, I think Phil Dick's sort of his state of mind, but also his physiology with his health problems, meant that his sense, I think you say in the book, and it's relevant to the Alice in Wonderland connection, I guess, that I think he felt a lot more detached from reality than perhaps the average person did. And I think that was one reason why he was so obsessed with the phoniness of existence, because to him, I think he experienced that kind of sense that it wasn't quite there, or it wasn't quite convincing enough. But I mean, there are so many different authors, and a lot of the romantics used hypnagogia as part of their creative process. And again, so I think we need to put him in a sort of a venerable history of people who basically use altered states.
As he work. It's quite fascinating. There's a fascinating section in the exegesis where he's discussing his interest in what basically Aldous Huxley would say was opening the doors of perception. The idea that certain mental states seem to open up the brain to a wider perceptual field. And he very much argues this, and we know he's not original. Aldous Huxley was doing it, C.T. Broad was doing it, Henri Bergson was doing it. But he puts it in a particular way because he puts it within the milieu of science fiction writing and the nature of reality. And he argued that under certain circumstances, there can be elements that can suppress the brain's ability to act as an attenuator and take information out. And he was particularly interested in GABA. As you know, I can never pronounce right. It's gamma-aminobutyric acid. And he was interested in the role of GABA because GABA is the main inhibitive neurotransmitter of the brain. Whereas if you can in some way inhibit GABA's effectiveness within the brain, you allow the brain to attenuate, to have a much broader worldview and see things in a different way. And of course, this links in very much with the writings and research of a neurologist who was at the Maudsley Hospital, has a Swedish name, Carl Janssen.
Oh yes, Carl Janssen. Yes.
Yeah, and his writings on ketamine. Yeah. And of course, he argued that this is what ketamine does. Ketamine suppresses probably GABA's ability to act as an attenuator. And in doing so, it allows the brain to open up. And of course, he argued that there must be an endogenous substance created by the brain that works in exactly the same way as ketamine, which is a synthetic horse tranquilizer, but it's synthetic. But the brain produces a natural version of this, which of course people, and I've written about this and you're aware of this, that it's something to do with endogenous DMT, dimethyltryptamine, being created by the pineal gland. Now this brings back to Phil, because Phil became fascinated after reading a paper by a writer called Gail Luce in around about 1972, 73. And she wrote a paper in Psychology Today. And she was discussing about the role of the pineal gland in all of this and how melatonin can be synthesized, and melatonin seems to act as seems to suppress the brain's ability to cut things out. And Phil became fascinated by this. But not only did he become fascinated by it, he then linked it, because if you read exegesis, and this is peculiar, and again, I think I'm the only person, again, I may not be, that spotted this, but if you read the exegesis, he has entities he calls the Sibyls.
Yes.
And that, if you can see it there,
yes,
Sibyl.
There's a sort of, yes.
And they have a third eye.
Up, actually.
Yeah.
Yes, the third eye.
And of course, the third eye is the equivalent of the pineal gland. And he was convinced that these Sibyls had been guiding him throughout his life, and they were permanently with him in his life. And he then came to the conclusion that the voice in his head, the guiding principle, the entities from Valis all the way along, were in fact his own higher self communicating with him from somewhere in orthogonal time. And as you know, this is my daemon eidolon dyad. So he calls it the diathon. I call it the dyad. But it's the same principle. Phil was going down exactly the same road I've gone down. It's quite uncanny how similar his ideas are to mine. The only thing is, I did the science, he did more the philosophy.
Yes, it's fascinating. I mean, perhaps you should just explain a tiny bit about your basic ideas, but also a little bit more how you think they relate to Philip K. Dick's, thoughts and experiences.
Okay, Phil was very much. He had a Gnostic worldview. He had the worldview that we intimated before, that there are two realities. There's the reality that we are captured within, which I call the Bohmian IMAX, and there is a reality behind this reality. Now, the Gnostics, the schismatic Christian sect in the early years of the church, came up with a similar argument. And their argument was they were trying to explain the mystery of why evil exists. And their argument was, how could a good God create evil? And they came to the conclusion that the reason a good God could create evil is because the good God that we think is the God of the Old Testament, Jehovah, Yahweh, is actually an entity called Yaldabaoth, which is the false creator, the demiurge. And the Yaldabaoth thinks he's God, and he's created this facsimile earth, this facsimile universe that we are trapped within. And all of us within this trapped world that we're trapped within, which we now would argue is an AI simulation, inside of us all is a little shard of the greater universe. Now, the ancient Greeks and the Gnostics had the term the kenoma, which is this reality, and the pleroma, which is the fullness, the real reality behind. And we all have a little shard of the pleroma inside us. Now, I argue that shard of the pleroma, they're using theological terminology to explain neurological issues to do with the way in which the brain functions. And I argue that, and my latest iteration on this is that, like Phil argued, Phil said, and Phil became fascinated by the writings of people like Julian Jaynes and his bicameral mind. And Phil was fascinated by the writings of Jaynes, and he got really into it. And again, if you read the exegesis, he cites Jaynes many, many times. And Julian Jaynes argues that it's to do with the hemispheres of the brain, that there are two personalities in all of us. And because we are now unicameral, because of the corpus callosum, which attaches the two sides of the brain, we are a singular consciousness. But in historical times, during the times of the ancient Greeks, for instance, because if you read the writings, as Julian Jaynes argued, you read the writings of Homer, for instance, there is no inner dialogue of the characters. The characters hear the voice of God, and the motive faction for all the actions in the Iliad are the voice of God telling somebody. And Jaynes argued this was because the brain then was bicameral, so it was in two sections, which meant that sometimes the thoughts that came from your non-dominant hemisphere came across the corpus callosum and was interpreted as a voice in the head by the dominant hemisphere. So therefore, we were bicameral or unicameral. So then the issue then is, well, if this is the case, how does it work neurologically? And I argue that he's got it slightly wrong. It's not the hemispheres of the brain. It's the neurons versus the glial network. And I argue that we know that 10% of the brain is made up of neurons which communicate electrochemically. But the glial network, which is 90% of the brain, this is where the story about 90, we only use 10% of our brain comes from. 90% of the brain are glial cells. Now, recent research has shown that the glial cells don't communicate electrochemically. They communicate non-locally using quantum mechanical effects, which means they have instantaneous communication. And I argue that within the brain, there is this everyday self which works neurologically, but there is this greater self which can communicate non-locally, not only with what's happening within the brain, but non-locally with everything else, because we know from superposition in quantum mechanics that everything is a singularity. So therefore, the non-local brain can communicate much greater and can communicate outside of, using again Gnostic terminology, the canoma, outside of the simulation. So this is what Phil argued as well. He argued that there were two sections to the brain and that we communicate with that section. And that section is what is the Sybil. It's Valis. Valis is the vast active living information system of his novel Valis.
Yep. And
in all these novels, he's again trying to get over this idea of two minds in people. You know, for instance, in what is the novel? The guy at the start, the novel that starts with the guy trying to deal with the insects all over his body. They made it in rotoscope.
Scanner Darkly.
Scanner Darkly. Yes. And in Scanner Darkly, you know, what is the central precept of a Scanner Darkly is the bicamerality of the brain. And the interesting, And the interesting thing here is, and he got interested in this. He researched Julian James. There's a guy called Orenstein that also did a lot of work in this area as well. And Phil concluded, quite interestingly in terms of this, about how certain drugs can open up these perceptions. And again, you get these ideas. I mean, one of the best introductions, I think, to the world of Philip K. Dick, and indeed my writing, is Waking Life, by the same director that did A Scanner Darkly using rotoscope.
Brilliant.
What was the director? I can't remember the director.
I can't remember either.
But check out A Waking Life, because they have lots of sections on Philip K. Dick in it, you know, where they have a character like Philip K. describing these things. So for Phil, this reality is, using the Gnostic term, it's something we exist within, and we suffer from something he called amnesis. That is, that we have forgotten what we really are, because we have to function within this world, within this simulation. But there are occasions when we get what's called anamnesis, which is the loss of memory. And suddenly we realize that we are cosmic creatures. Another person that he really liked the work of was Maurice Buck, who in 1900 wrote a book called the Cosmic Mind, or whatever it was. And again,
Cosmic Consciousness.
Cosmic Consciousness. So again, you have that applying, he's kind of distilling all the great writers and thinkers. He was also a guy called Binswanger, who came up with, in the 1930s, a different form of psychiatry, where he was talking about the mind having three separate sections to it. And we exist within it. Is it the Umwelt, the Mitwelt, and I can't think of the third idea, but it's the idea that we have an external world that the brain focuses, an internal world that we focus on, and then a greater universe that's bigger than that. So it's almost a triune model of consciousness. And Phil was intrigued by this as well. You know, the idea of, you know, can we attune into these different levels? And this is the theme of my writing, and has been for the last 2 decades, was discussing the science of this. But your point is a really valid one. Please don't misunderstand what I'm saying here and what we are saying here. We are not dissing these experiences. We're saying they are real because nobody knows what an hallucination is. So before we start saying, oh, it's an hallucination, it's brain-created hallucination. Sorry, everybody, everything is a brain-created hallucination. That's how consciousness works. It internally generates a facsimile of the outside universes and gives it to consciousness.
But also, I think we're in territory where fact blurs with fiction. And I think this is the fascinating thing about Phil Dick's life, the same ambiguity in his novels, because in his novels, a lot of the time, you don't know what the ground of reality is. And quite often there isn't a ground of reality. And I think the same thing was true of Phil Dick's life. Certainly hearing interviews with people who knew him, I think it was very, very much like that. It's like there was a time when there was a raid on his flat, and he came across, he basically came out with about half a dozen different theories of who it might have been. It might have been drug dealers, it might have been the police, it might have been the FBI, or maybe he even did it himself.
Mm.
And his life was just full of incidents like that, wasn't it, where there was a confusion between. So I think that's the way to approach it, almost as a literary text, actually.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is that he very much discussed this in the very famous Rolling Stone interview that he did. But he did some interesting things again in terms of, as you say, the fact and fiction blurring. But then again, it's an interesting one here, and it's something interesting philosophically, because there is the great American philosopher Pierce, and he came up with the concept of the phaneron, the idea that we by our training, by the way we are educated and everything, we effectively interpret the external world in a very particular way. And we all interpret the world subtly differently or hugely differently, depending upon the bees in our bonnet. The idea of
Yes.
how we expect the world to be. We anticipate the world and expect it to be that way. And it normally fulfills it, except when we take mind-altering drugs and something, and suddenly that phaneron gets broken down. Now, this phaneron can again be applied, and I don't know if Phil was aware of this work, but there was the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. The idea that language structures the way we see the world. Now, there's the weak Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which is just the way we identify things depends upon our words. But the strong Sapir-Whorf hypothesis claims that without language, we are almost incapable of interpreting the stimuli that's coming in, because we need language to structure it in a way to make sense. And the reason this was because a guy called Edmund Lee Wolfe was working with Hopi Indians in the 1940s and discovered that Hopi children didn't work very well within Western schools. And he discovered the reason being was the way their indigenous language worked was non-linear, and the way their verbs were formed were different. So even the way we form, a past, present, and future, the idea of we have verbs that change depending upon whether we're talking about the future or the past. That's a linear thing. But if you live in a culture where the past and the present and the future are all effectively existent now, which many cultures do believe, or that time is circular, their worldview is different. So we're talking talk and chalk and cheese. And as a sociologist, I was always fascinated by the sociology of religion, why it is that certain people implicitly believe things that the rest of us can't. And it's because their religious training makes them see the world and interpret the things they see around them from a very, very definite explanatory model. Whereas people like myself, who are agnostic or atheist, we don't have that explanatory model, so therefore we end up confused. Whereas God did it, explains everything, doesn't it? It's all the big plan of God. And of course, Phil, because of his religious interests and his Episcopalianism and everything else as well, he very much took a religious viewpoint. And of course, that brings us right round to the 2374 incidents, where he believed he was the reincarnation of a guy called Thomas who was living in 50 AD. And
Yes.
since 50 AD, time had stopped. And time stopped then, and the rest of it's been an illusion since then.
So again, there's a lot to unpack there, but anyone who wants a dramatized version of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis should watch Denis Villeneuve's adaptation of Arrival.
Yeah.
Because that's pretty much the idea that you just said.
And even more so, the message that people miss about Arrival is the creepiness of the whole storyline. It's circular. Yeah. It's my hypothesis. We go round and round because the opening sequences are the end sequences. And the relationship with her and her daughter. It's a fascinating book. movie.
What's so interesting is how these themes recur, but I'd like to pick up on something you touched on earlier, which is these entities, because I think we were talking before the show, and it's mentioned in your book that Philip K. Dick's experiences seem to have very distinct parallels with alien abduction experiences, namely Whitley Strieber. So could you explain a little bit about the relevance of that and also Dick's connection with Whitley Strieber as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when Phil was interviewed by two journalists, Apple and Scott Apple, and I can't think what the second guy's name was, but they came to visit him in his house towards the end of his life. And Phil was describing a series of dreams he had, which involved the entities I pointed on before, the Sybils, these creatures with big eyes and a third eye and everything else as well. And Phil particularly said they had avocado-shaped faces. Now, when they were describing this in the interview, and Phil was describing this, one of the, I think it was Appel, turned round to Phil and said, well, are you aware of the Barney and Betty Hill case from 1961? And he said, do you remember the Hill case? And he said he didn't. And he said, well, effectively, what you're describing here is very similar, because there was an argument to say that Betty and Barney Hill, because most of the abduction was brought back through hypnosis. You know, they didn't remember at the time. They just had, I think it was called was it called The Interrupted Journey, the book?
Yes, the Fuller book, yes.
Yeah, and they were in the White Mountains, weren't they? And they're driving along, and suddenly it's 20 minutes later or half an hour later, and they don't know what had happened, but they'd seen something in the sky. Now, it seems that, you know, they took them back, and there was all these kind of things done to her. They were particularly fascinated because it was an interracial relationship as well, which the aliens were interested in. But the way she described the aliens became the kind of almost the theme for it. But then Whitley Strieber, I think it was in 1989, was it? I think that Whitley had his experience again in upstate
85.
85, thank you, in upstate New York, when he was a successful science fiction writer or horror writer, and he'd made sufficient money. He'd made a lot of money from The Howling, and there was
it was the Wolfen and also the Hunger as well
The
with
Hunger,
David
which
Bowie.
they did with Deneuve and Bowie. Yeah.
Yeah.
He told me all about, when I met him, he was telling me about when he met Catherine Deneuve, because I know Whitley quite well now, spent a lot of time with him. And he was saying that she was the most elegant, beautiful woman he'd ever met. You know, he was saying she was just sensational. But that's an aside, really. So he then goes up to this place in upstate New York, and something happens to him. And he effectively discovers that he had been abducted, and had been abducted for most of his life, by these entities. And the book cover of Communion, when it came out, is the archetypal grey. But the archetype, you look at that cover, and then you look at Phil's drawing of the Sybil, they're identical.
Yeah.
Now, again, in one of my previous books, The Hidden Universe, I discuss about the human interface between the others and everything. And my own mother had an encounter with those entities. Oh, this is extraordinary. It's a bit of a side, but it fits in with the overall narrative here. My mother phones me up one evening, and she said, her and my auntie, both widows, were walking onto the village I was brought up on. And she said, my auntie had stopped to tie a shoelace. My mother looked over towards a place called Port Sunlight, which is a quite famous village. And she said she saw what she described as a smoke disk circling in the sky, and then it shot off at great speed towards North Wales, which I subsequently know really happened. It wasn't an hallucination, because a friend of mine contacted me a year later to say, she said, I saw that object on that day. I know exactly, because I was on the main road, the A41, on a bus, and I saw it fly over towards North Wales. So it was something objective. It was something outside of her. It wasn't part of her visual phase. Now, my mother is partially sighted, and everything, or she was partially sighted. So she could have been registered blind. So it could have been quite difficult for her to see things like that. But anyway, so she asked me what it was, and I said, I don't know. So anyway, a week later, she phones up one morning, and she's in hysterics. And I said, Mum, calm down. And she said, something really awful happened last night. And I said, what? And she said, I was lying in bed, middle of the night, I couldn't move. She had sleep paralysis. And she said, but my face was turned towards the door of my bedroom and the door was open. And then she said, I thought to myself, I always close the door. Why is the door open? And then she said, as she did it, and it still makes shivers down my spine, she turned and she said she saw 3 spindly fingers come round the edge of the door, and this creature poke its head out, blink, and jump back as if it didn't expect her to be aware of it. And she said, my God, Tony, what did I see? She described it as it had a pointed chin, it had huge black eyes, it had 2 holes for a nose and a slit for a mouth. Now, my mother wouldn't know a grey if it bit her on the bottom. Okay? She described exactly a grey. Now, I then started to get worried about this because I thought she's starting to hallucinate. And interestingly enough, in tying in with something I call my Huxleyan spectrum, she was developing Alzheimer's. And she started hallucinating little creatures that were following her around and singing to her and everything else. And it's all part of what's called Charles Bonnet syndrome. But it's again the idea that whatever these are, we're again arguing, the brain's attenuator. What's happening is the Alzheimer's is actually eroding the microtubules in the brain, the structures that hold together the neurons, because that's what happens. The amyloid plaques just explode the microtubules in the brain. So it's stopping the brain's ability. It's like, again, GABA. It's stopping the GABA way of, and the doors of perception are opened wider. So she described the same kind of creatures that Whitley described and everybody else. Now, they then pointed out to Phil about Whitley Strieber, and Phil communicated with Whitley. And I discussed this with Whitley because every year now I do a thing called Contact in the Desert over in Los Angeles. Well, in Palm Springs, actually. Not even Palm Springs, Indian Wells. But he was discussing this, and he said it was very interesting the way in which they interfaced with each other and discussed their experiences. I don't think they ever met, but they had planned to. Now, funnily enough, then Phil became more interested in not only entity encounters, but being abducted. And he then contacted a guy called Brad Steiger.
Yes.
And Brad Steiger was known for being a guy that dealt with the others and entities. And again, I chatted with Brad many, many years ago, and funnily enough, I was planning to interview him, and he died suddenly, which was very, very sad. But again, we have Phil's idea that he had been abducted on many occasions, and I've got evidence from the book that not only that, but he had encounters with men in black, MIBs, which are the standard trope within ufology. The idea of these men driving around in 1950s style cars, and they turn up at your house and they ask you questions. He had MIBs turn up at his house. He also claims he was abducted and had a period of time that was out of his mind, couldn't remember, when he was up, I think, in Vancouver, and he had a period of lost time then. And he then started, when he started chatting with Tess, his 5th wife, his final wife, and he came to the conclusion that he had been linked with her for many, many years, and they'd known each other. And Phil argued that he believed he'd been part of a program for young gifted children, and he actually called the organization SolarCon. And he said that SolarCon had them together years before. So when things started to happen during 2374, he started to realize that they'd always been interested in him in one way or another. He then came to the conclusion that he was a starseed, that he had been in some way, he wasn't fully human. And towards the end of his life, he wrote extensively about this. And he had the idea that he was something called a homoplasmate, which is a kind of an amalgamation of alien and human DNA. And he was really interested in this as he approached death. It was something that really became a big issue to him, which, again, a lot of people don't focus in on because they like the other stuff, but they don't like this kind of weird stuff that Phil was interested in. They just like the science fiction writer. But he clearly felt that these entities, the Sybils, these beings he was seeing, had been communicating with him for forever. And this is why, again, he wrote The Owl in Daylight. He was very much keen. And of course, The Owl in Daylight is such a wonderful description of being blinded by the reality. You know, you're an owl, you're
Yes.
used to darkness, and suddenly you're given the light, and you can't see properly. You can't see the information around you. So his work was really, really intriguing. And I think, again, was he exaggerating? Well, all I can say is that whereas he could have been exaggerating to a degree in his interviews, which he did, he played up to people, in his novels, he was fictionalizing his own experiences. But in the exegesis was written for Phil. It was his own notes. He wasn't writing for somebody else. These were his genuine thoughts. These were the things that were really playing on his mind. And the honesty that comes out of the exegesis is extraordinary. You really realize this is a man struggling with extraordinary circumstances. And his brain is bouncing here, there, and everywhere. You know, he was such an eclectic thinker. You know, he was so bright. And he was able to pull together information from everywhere. And in doing so, he came up with a model of reality that seems extraordinarily similar to mine, which is, again, interesting.
I think, again, we've got these very recurrent themes. I mean, I'd be interested to hear what your thoughts are on the status of these, you know, the entities encountered during abductions, because we've acknowledged that they're closely associated with things like sleep paralysis, and I think that's been a common observation with the abduction literature in general. But at the same time, there seems to be this implication that they're not just subjective hallucinations, that they might actually, I don't know, exist on some level. Or so, what are your thoughts about that?
In my book, The Hidden Universe, this was exactly the theme I take. And I have a concept I call the egregorial. And I use the egregorial in a very precise terminology here. Egregore is from Greek for watcher. And if you read the book of Enoch, the apocryphal Gospel of Enoch, the egregores, the watchers, are very much central to it. And as time developed, the Kabbalists became very interested in this idea of entity creation, that we can bring into this existence entities from somewhere. Now, John Dee, for instance, when he was doing his work in Elizabethan times, he was trying to create entities, bringing them through so he could manipulate and control them. And this is part of black magic, the idea that you can create like a golem, you know, a thought form that you can then be at your bidding. Of course, we know even Aleister Crowley was doing this when he was creating Aiwass. Well, Aiwass was more of his higher self, I think, but there was another creature he created. And again, if you look at Crowley's drawings of the entities that came through, they're greys. It's just the only difference is their eyes are smaller, but they're the same kind of entities. Now, I believe what's taking place here, it's almost an extrapolation from my Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, that we in some way mold the external world to our anticipations. And I believe this again comes down to quantum mechanics. And again, I'm different to many other writers in the sense I don't just make these statements. I go back to the science to say, well, is that possible? Is it possible that we can in some way bring into existence things? Now, if we have what's called the collapse of the wave function, which is something known within quantum mechanics, that a subatomic particle, until it is observed or measured, is a statistical wave of probability. In other words, until it exists, it is a mathematical structure. Okay? So the idea then is that, well, if this is the case, then there's an interface between consciousness and external reality. Is this a symbiotic relationship whereby consciousness creates external reality and we are all co-creating this reality we see around us because we all agree it's consensual in the sense we expect reality to work in a particular way? But when things start to break down is when some people, as I say now, I argue, is moving into the glial network within the brain. The reality that is being collapsed starts to morph and starts to change, which is what Phil is arguing in all of his books. You know, you focus in on something. He's such a literate guy. I mean, one of the statements he says in Exegesis, which Only if you're fairly well read in the area will spot. He makes a concept about he felt like he was Jacob Boehme. And Jacob Boehme was a Protestant mystic in the 17th century. And I remember a line he once said whereby you could go insane by just considering and looking at a pewter dish. Because, when you put focus in on something, when instead of actually working in this world of generality, which we do, is focusing in for a second on something as it is in the world. Something that people like Heidegger would argue, the German philosophers, the idea of what is something in the world? What is it? Is it something, is an extension of me in some way? And you look at it and it will morph and it will change and it will look different. And we know this is what Mindhunter and Dogstroke. We know that Aldous Huxley, when he started looking at things, when he took peyote, and they suddenly started to change. Now, is that because the mind is making them change? Or are they changing in reality? Or is it that we need to define more accurately what we mean by external reality in the first place before we start saying, oh, external reality is real and this isn't, and my thoughts aren't? Well, just because your thoughts are non-physical doesn't mean they're not real, because they're there. It's just they don't have extension in space. They don't have extensor. They're not out there, but they're real. In which case, everything that you are internally modeling about the external world that's being presented to your consciousness now is being modeled internally. So none of it is real. None of it is real. So, and we know this now from quantum mechanics. We know it now from the idea of the simulation argument, the idea that the nature of reality is holographic in nature. So if this is the case, there's a feedback mechanism, which means that these things exist because we will them to exist. It's the concept of the tulpa within Tibetan Buddhism. The idea that you can collectively create a thought form which will then become independent of you. Now, we know that from the Philip experiment in 1970 in Toronto, where a group of individuals created a thought form that manifested, they created it was completely fictional. They created a fictional character called Philip Aylesford. And that character manifested in Ouija board and then started physically changing things. The tables were turning. There was poltergeist activity. They had to literally get rid of this character because they brought it forward from their own collective unconscious. Now, again, we know from Jungian archetypes, from Jungian psychology, the idea that the mind is far more powerful than we believe it is. Now, could it be that there are entities that exist in the fifth dimension that can be drawn into this by our own creation of them? In other words, they are already there, but they need us to think about them to be able to come through. Now, again, I used to work very closely with an ex-Catholic priest who used to do a show in America called Paul Eno. In fact, he's the cousin of Brian Eno, the Roxy music.
Yeah.
And Paul is a fascinating character. I mean, he ceased being a priest because the church didn't like him and his mates running around New England trying to find ghosts. But he was telling me that the amount of times he's been on ghost hunts and he's been working on this thing. One of his books are brilliant. I mean, Waltzing Round the Graveyard is a brilliant book. He died 2 years ago, sadly, but his work is astonishing. And he was telling me, he said he is absolutely convinced, and with my ideas, and he said, your ideas are spot on, because he said, I have witnessed these things coming through. And he said, he thinks they use plasma. They're a form of plasma, and they use electrical fields to actually come into this world through our anticipations, because, of course, the brain works electrically. So there's a link here. And I was then recalled something that I found really quite creepy. And it's the idea that in Islamic belief, the jinn. Now, if you read the Quran, it says that man was made of mud, the angels were made of light, and the jinn were made of smokeless fire. What is smokeless fire? It's plasma. And the shiver goes down your spine and you go, woof. Now, this is something of interest here. Now, again, and a lot of researchers have argued that this is what is taking place even with UFOs, that we create UFOs in our anticipation. Now, when I was at Contact in the Desert last year, there was a UFO flew over the event. I didn't see it, but lots of other people did. That UFO was manifested by the people's anticipation of expecting one. What's the chances of a UFO just happening to fly over the world's biggest UFO festival? Except that everybody's thinking about UFOs. There's hundreds of people outside all thinking, want to see a UFO, want to see a UFO. So the UFO comes into this reality and it flies across. Nobody else outside the hotel saw it. But then something really curious happened. And this is, I still don't understand this. I told that story. I did an event in Southend about a month after I came back last summer. And I was talking about various things. And this, at the end of it, this lady comes over to me and she had a phone with her. And she said, can you explain this? And she showed me a video. And it's a video of her standing, looking outside of the window of her flat, looking out the Thames estuary from Southend. And she's looking through the window and you hear her saying, she said, oh, what's that? And you see these line of objects flying along, about 5 or 6 of them. And the one in the front goes then to the back and then they go along and then they keep doing this as they're flowing along. And she's filming it, and she said maybe it's a reflection in the glass while she's filming, and she opens the window, and they're still there. And it's at that point you realise she's not alone. And there's another woman with her, and you hear her say to the woman, can't you see that? And she said, I can't see anything. And she said, there's 6 UFOs flying over the Thames estuary. Look, I'm filming it. And the woman goes, there's nothing there, I can't see anything. And then she switches off, and she said, and I spoke to my friend and she didn't see anything, but she turned around and she said, but it's on the film. She said, if it was an hallucination that I was having, how is it that it registers on the film? Now I'm then remembered, and I said, have you heard of the man called Ted Sirius? And Ted Sirius was a guy, do you remember he used to impose his thoughts onto film?
Yes, thoughtography, yeah.
Thoughtography. So he was anticipating again, and he brings into reality something that registers on film. And I think this woman had done that with her video film. So this means...
So curious.
So when you see a UFO, don't assume the person standing next to you will see it, because they may not. Because you're a believer in UFOs. And this is again what Jacques Vallée and various other of the people that are not part of the extraterrestrial hypothesis argue. That UFOs, as Jung said, is something, it's a collective unconscious projecting things that are seen in the sky.
There's a wonderful science fiction novel by Ian Watson called Miracle Visitors, which explores exactly that hypothesis. And I would, if you haven't read it, I would urge you to do so, because he talks exactly about tulpas and the Jungian archetypes and projecting reality. And it's a tiny bit Philip K. Dickian, because you don't know where the ground of reality is. So it's basically about this consciousness researcher who hypnotizes this student who recalls an abduction in his childhood, and it gets weirder from there, because these UFOs start manifesting themselves. And yes, it's extraordinary. And actually, I think Jenny Randall's the UFO researcher, interviewed Ian Watson, and he was writing it up north, near Rossendale, at a time during the massive UFO wave that Jenny has written about. We're talking, oh, by the way, synchronicity, Port Sunlight was the answer in a pub quiz that I went to on Saturday.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
So I think we're starting to get the synchronicities happening, but it's this stuff is so. The thing is, it's very far out, but I really think that if you travel in these sort of waters regularly, things do get this weird. I mean, what's interests me about a lot of these experiences, how permeable they are. So the classic idea of the alien abduction is it's a nuts and bolts spaceship that lands and the aliens pick people up and then they put them down. But actually, if you even a cursory reading or cursory knowledge of, well, say Whitley Strieber's experiences are a prime example. It's mixed in with altered states, out-of-body experiences, precognition, and do you think the main reason why Phil Dick didn't identify as an abductee was simply because it wasn't as high profile culturally.
Well, it's funny actually. One of the weirdest things happened to me at Contact in the Desert last year. What Whitley's fascinated me for many, many years, and many years ago I got hold of his book, The Master of the Key.
Okay, yep.
Now, The Master of the Key is not one of his better known books, but it's very, very strange because it describes he's in a hotel room in Toronto on a book tour. And at about midnight, there's a knock on his door of the hotel room, and this guy walks in. And initially, he thought he was one of the people bringing food or something, you know, and he said, I hadn't ordered any food. But the guy said, no, I need to talk to you. And he sits down, and for 3 hours, this guy talks to him about the most amazing things. And then he just walks out and disappears. So I was interested in talking to Whitley about this. So when I knew I was going to be meeting him, he's interviewed me a couple of times where I was going to be meeting him face to face because we were both speaking at Contact in the Desert. So last year, I decided I would pack my copy of Master of the Key, and I'd take it with me over to America, and I'd get Whitley to sign it. So first few days, we kept meeting each other. He came to one of my, it was lovely. He came to one of my talks and he turned around and he said, God, that's one of the most amazing talks I've ever seen. And I thought, my hero, you know, yeah, it was just extraordinary to have somebody say that. And he said, we must meet up for lunch. And he said, let's arrange it. I'll get my secretary or somebody to arrange something. So the first day it doesn't happen. And then he contacts me. He said, yeah, we can meet up today at 12 o'clock or something. And I said, okay, I go back to my bedroom and I realized I'd forgotten the book. And I thought, oh, damn, I've forgotten it. But never mind, it's not that important. So I then go downstairs and I'd just had my breakfast. So it was early in the morning. There was nobody around. It was this kind of big area, but at that time it was really quiet. So there's nobody around. And all of the talent, the people that there are speakers, you have your own table in the section. And I'm sitting at my table and there's nobody else around. And I'm phoning my wife, and I phone Penny up because the time difference, early morning, works perfectly. And I'm chatting to her. And I finished the phone call and I put the phone down, and sitting in the middle of the floor in front of me, this area is probably 100 foot by 50 foot, there's a book. And I look at it and I go, and there's nothing else there, just a book sitting. Nobody had walked past me. It just appeared from nowhere. And I went over and picked it up. It was Whitley's book, The Master of the Key. And it was annotated, so it wasn't, you know, somebody had underlined sections of it. And I see Whitley that lunchtime. And I say, you're not going to believe what just happened. And he said, yeah, it seems to happen all the time. Now, I cannot explain that. And, you know, I still can't, my brain. And it was exactly the same edition that I'd lost. And it wasn't my copy, because I know it wasn't. You know, because I've now got 2 copies, because I could show you that where if I find them. But I've got 2 copies of it now that are identical, except one's got annotations. And that's what makes you realize that the universe it was coincidence. Yeah, you could say it was coincidence, but surely somebody dropped a book. They would say, oh, I lost my Whitley Strieber book. I asked many people that I could, did anybody here have the Whitley Strieber book? Nobody. So what was just the book I needed to discuss the Master of the Key with him? Because I argue the Master of the Key is his daemon. It's his own higher self that manifested in his life, as Phil would say, in exactly the same way. So these things are just weird, aren't they? You know, it's just, and as you say, it's as if the universe kind of shimmers. It kind of morphs to your anticipations of it in some way. I mean, my group, when we used to meet, and funnily enough, again, Port Sunlight link, one of the groups we used to meet in the Bridge Inn in Port Sunlight, one of our meeting points when I lived up there. And we always used to argue that we could manifest the most peculiar things, like this one. Again, you came to my J.B. Priestley talk. And one of the things I talked about was the J.B. Priestley letters, as you recall. And one of the letters I read out when you saw me talk was the letter about the Farnborough Air Show. Do you remember? And there's a guy on holiday down in just a quick backtrack. J.B. Priestley was on BBC television in 1962, I think it was, on the Monitor programme on a Sunday evening in March. He asked the audience, or Q Weldon, who was the guy that ran the program, asked the audience if anybody had had strange time slips, could they send the letters in to the BBC, and they'd send them to Mr. Priestley because he was writing a book on it, which subsequently became Man and Time. Anyway, one of the letters, I was then given access. I became friendly with Tom Priestley, J.B. Priestley's son, and Tom allowed me access to the letters. They're at the Cambridge University Library, all the letters that were sent to him, and I'm the only person that's gone through them all. Well, the letters there, and then annotated them in my book on J.B. Priestley, Time in the Rose Garden. So the whole second section of these letters, including this one. And in the letter, the guy says that he was down in Dorset on holiday with his wife, and they'd planned on their way back from Dorset to call in at the Farnborough Air Show. This is 1952, September 1952. Decided they'd call in at the Farnborough Air Show. The night before, his wife wakes up in the middle of the night and said, "We can't go there. I've just had a most terrible dream. I saw a silver aircraft fly over, go through the sound barrier, then disintegrate. And the engine fell and people were killed and it was awful. I don't want to go." He talks her out of it. They go to the show. And as they're at the show, she suddenly grasps his hand and said, "There's that plane." And it was the Sea Vixen, de Havilland something or other, that was being flown by a guy called John Derry, who was a top test pilot at the time. And as the plane came over, the husband turned around and said, "No, it's not the same plane." He says, "You said specifically it was silver. That plane's black." And it was. The plane goes over and it lands, and there's no problem. Then they go home. And the next evening, breaking news from the Farnborough Air Show: there's been a terrible disaster. 58 people have been killed. John Derry's been killed. His co-pilot, Tony Hollander's been killed. It's really awful. The plane went through the sound barrier, disintegrated and crashed. What's terrifying about this is that the plane that crashed was not the plane she saw. The plane she saw was the proper one, but it went tech. There was problems with it. So Derry went back to Cardington together with his team, and they picked up the prototype, which hadn't been painted, which was silver. And that was the plane that crashed. And that was exactly the plane she saw in the dream. Now, I'd argue this is evidence of J.W. Dunn's idea that future precognitions are not you being at the event. The future precognitions are when you see them. Because I argue in the past life, she saw that on the Pathé News reel when they went to
Oh, I
cinema.
see, yeah.
And if you go online, the Pathé News thing is still available on YouTube, so you can see this. Now, the weird story about this is I tell this story. I had my little Walker group of people. We used to meet every 2 weeks at the Walker Art Gallery in Liverpool. It's a large group of people, about 15, 20 people. And this time round, Professor Sean Street, a poet, and his wife joined us because they're from Liverpool and they were planning to move back from Bournemouth. So he joins us. And we got talking about synchronicities and everything. And then we moved on. And I said, and of course, you know, the J.B. Priestley letters. And I told that story. As I'm telling the story, rather similar to the people in the audience when I was in Bolton, Sean starts going, oh. And I said, "Sean, what's the problem?" And he said, "I'll tell you later." So I finished the story. And Sean then leans forward and goes, "You deal with statistics?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "What is the statistical chance of you telling that story about an event that happened in 1952? This was about 2011, 2012, something like that. And one of the people in your audience is somebody who was there and witnessed it and actually has done a radio program on it." And Sean had. Apparently, when he was young, his father was big into aviation, and they went down from Liverpool to the show. But the really weird thing is that Sean turned around and he said, "But there's a more interesting thing to this." He said, when we left that morning, my mother turned around and she said, I've got a terrible feeling about what's going to happen today. Please, please, please don't stand where you normally stand at the Farnborough Air Show." And they normally used to stand in this bank area that was banked up. They didn't. That's where the engines hit. Him and his father were killed. Now, again, shivers up the spine. You can explain that away as much as you like. We had all those rooted coincidences, the fact that he'd done all that and everything else as well. And then I got evidence of this because that afternoon, I used to do BBC Radio Merseyside, And I used to have, every 2 weeks, I'd do a show with Billy Butler, one of the famous guys up there. And Billy and I used to do a show. And I decided to do that show to discuss the Farnborough Air Show incident. But because that morning Sean had been in my group, we got Sean to phone in. He was driving back to Bournemouth and he phoned in to tell Billy how that coincidence had happened. I still have that recording of that show. Now, to me, that shows how everything just, it conspires. It's almost like Jacques Vallée would call the cosmic joker. It's going, you think you know what's going on. It's much more mysterious than we can ever imagine.
Yes, it is like, I mean, I've discussed this with my colleague, Bethany Butzer, actually, because she's very interested in synchronicities. And it is like it's some expression of some underlying intelligence, so we can always make the law of large numbers arguments. But I don't know, there does seem to be this ordering factor in some of these things. It's responsive, as you say, to various things. So,
well, as Jung called it, the acausal principle. There is no causality going on here. It's an acausal principle, but it seems to be significant. And the more you pay attention to them, the more you see. But then again, that would be the law of large numbers. That would be what Wiseman would argue would be the anticipation that something's going to occur, that kind of thing.
But you see, I think that when we're talking about different people seem to live in subtly different realities, I get that with the believers versus skeptics arguments all the time. So I read a book like Chris French's Science of Weird Stuff, and then I read a book like, I don't know, Beyond Physicalism by Ed Kelly, and I think these guys live in different universes, and they both, for them, it makes sense to the individual. But if you stack it side by side, you think, is it a matter of who's right or who's wrong? Or is it, I think it's more like an ongoing negotiation, actually, between different people and between reality. So I'm not saying that, if you believe the Earth is flat, it's flat. I don't think it's actually quite that simple. I think there are definitely physical parameters, but I also think that things are much more muzzy.
There is also going on a subtle evasion here as well, because Chris French attended one of my lectures for ASAP, the Association for the Study of Anomalous Phenomenon, and I gave a lecture at one of the universities a few years ago, and I had lunch with Chris afterwards, and also there was the female psychologist with the green hair,
Sue Blackmore.
Sue was there as well, and I engaged with both of them. And they never comment on the things I write about. It's as if I'm persona non grata. They'll write about certain people, but I've never seen any, and I don't know why this is, any even acknowledgement from the Chris Frenches of this world, the Wisemans of this world, or the Sue Blackmores. And Sue knows me. She knows me by Tony. We've done events together. It's as if my work is something that they really can't deal with. And because they can't deal with it, the best thing to do is just completely ignore it. And that's what happens. It is just ignored. I'm desperate to engage with these people to discuss my ideas, but they don't seem to want to know. Whereas they'll happily engage with the slightly more woo-woo people, because it's easy to engage with the woo-woo people because you can dismiss their ideas easily. I'm not quite so easy to dismiss. You may think now, your readers may think now that, I've spent hours researching all this so I can just regurgitate it. That's not how my brain works. My brain works because the information's in here, So one day I would look, funnily enough, I'm delighted to say that a chapter that I was asked to write by the Society for Psychical Research on what happens to human consciousness at the point of death has now been accepted. They're bringing out a new book, actually, funnily enough, called "Is There Life After Death?"
Yeah, I'm in it.
You're in it as well. Congratulations!
Yes, I am. I've got a chapter. Yeah.
We're both in it.
But,
so
yes.
I sent a message to them a couple of days ago asking, do they know when it's coming out? I don't know if you,
Yes, I want to know too.
and I've not got a reply. I got a nice response.
SPR, we want to know.
They want to know because we can't find it because we're so looking forward to it. Because that looks like it's going to be a really interesting book, and I'm so
Yes,
delighted. But I'm delighted you're in it as well.
yeah. It's been a long time in coming. I'm conscious that we're coming up to 2 hours, so we need to. Can you to summarize? Can you just say what you think the significance of Philip K. Dick is for readers today, particularly for readers who are interested in consciousness, and why someone who hasn't read Philip K. Dick should absolutely read Philip K. Dick?
Because you're missing such a treat is the only words. I will say he's not the greatest writer. He has a number of novels which are called his Brokeback novels, where it is obvious that he's writing one book, runs out of steam and starts another one. And he does do that on a number of occasions. But you're reading his work for his ideas. And effectively, when you know the man himself and you know the bees in his bonnet, it makes the books all the more interesting. They are intellectually challenging, and the greatest fun is basically reading the books and joining the dots. And as you said, seeing the themes that run through them, how he comes back and he writes the same story again and again. I mean, for instance, Valis was rewritten as, towards the end of his life. And I can't think of the name of the novel. Again, an associate of mine made a movie on it.
Oh, is it the Radio Free Album?
Well done, Radio Free Albemuth. And there's somebody I know quite well, whose name escapes me at the moment, did a movie version of it, which is very good.
Oh,
And
I need to see that. I was looking at the trailer yesterday, actually. So,
were you? Ah,
yeah.
yes, it's good. It's good. I was hoping to interview him on my podcast. My must actually reminded me to do that. But again, he's got the same story, and he comes from different angles. But then you have sheer brilliant books like The Man in the High Castle.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
How clever. And of course, they did the TV series, but they miss out on the subtlety of Dick's writing by making it a big blockbuster, just like Blade Runner.
Total Recall. Oh, Blade Runner, but also Total Recall as well.
Yeah, you miss the power of it all. And I mean, for instance, in The Man in the High Castle, there is so much symbolism. There's the I Chang is in there because Phil said that he wrote it using the I Chang, for the plot lines. Then you have the wonderful time slips with Mr. Tacoma, where he's sitting there and he's in America when it's ruled by the Japanese, and suddenly there's a shimmer, and suddenly he's in San Francisco in the 1970s, and there's the Embarcadero flyover in front of him. And again, that was Phil writing from his own experience, because again, that shimmering light, so I don't know if you recall, but Tacoma, there's a pendant that Tacoma has, or a jewel.
Oh, yes.
The light flashes in his eyes, and he's suddenly in an alternate time state. This is exactly what I'd argue that happened to Phil, because again, the light shimmering off the girl's pendant or off the reflector, again, as if Tacoma has gone into whatever his name was. Can't remember it was Tacoma, something like that. It's as if he'd gone into a migraine state and gone into an altered state of consciousness.
But obviously, The Man in the High Castle was once again written about a decade before that happened.
Yes, again. And of course, The Man in the High Castle is interesting in the sense, and Phil does this a lot, it's a novel within a novel. Because, of course, the Man in the High Castle is this novelist that's written this alternate history where America won the Second World War, whereas people are living in an alternate history to us where we lost it. And that in itself is clever. But I know from my research that Phil's ideas for that came from a novel written in the early 1950s called Bring on the Jubilee, where somebody had written an alternate story of what had happened if the Confederate States had won the American Civil War.
Okay, yeah.
And of course, I'd argue that would have been featured at that time because the anniversary of the American Civil War from 1861 to 1865 was taking place when Phil was writing The Man in the High Castle. So it's likely he took the idea, but he made it far cleverer. Because in The Man in the High Castle, in Bring on the Jubilee, there is again a novel within the novel. So the trope is in there, you know. But just read it for the sheer fun of it. But read the background, you know, read my biography, but read the other biographies as well. You know, there's a number of them. They're all excellent. They're all good. They're all worth it. And then if you get the chance, just dip into the exegesis. But if you do, I suggest, as I said, get it on Kindle, because then you can just search for a particular theme and you'll find all the references. Otherwise, it will drive you crazy because it's all over the place.
Yeah, yes, I'll definitely have to have another go at that. But yes, I mean, I'd say pretty much the same things that you've said. That once you get led into the sort of Philip K. Dick world, it's an endless sort of labyrinth of fascination, weirdness, you know, paranoia in a good way. But I don't know. There's a compulsive quality about his novels. So sometimes they're a little slow to start, but if you
Yes.
crack on with them, then it's like I seem to remember Martian Time Slips a little bit like that. It sorts you think, oh, this is okay, and then suddenly, you know, it goes from about 0 to 100 miles an hour in terms of weirdness and reality bending, and you honestly don't know where you are. And I think that's he's so unique, and I like a number of the adaptations of Dick's work that have been done, but I don't think any, except perhaps Scanner Darkly, quite captures the atmosphere of the novel. So if you think, oh, I've seen Blade Runner, I don't need to read Do Androids Dream, that's absolutely wrong. I mean, it's very funny, apart from anything else. It starts with an argument between a husband and a wife who are using this thing called the Penfield mood organ.
Oh, yeah.
And they sort of fight by setting different strange moods on the dial, and it's just hilariously fun. And that's the other thing, he's very funny at times.
It is. And it's very, very sad in many ways that he was very keen to be a serious novelist, and he wrote three, maybe four non-science fiction novels or non-speculative fiction, and they really failed. But they're worth checking out as well. But yeah, it's his humor. It's laugh out loud. I think his characterizations could be deeper, but he's not writing that kind of thing. And also probably he didn't write women terribly well, really.
No, I mean, you know, I think I've had my sort of female science fiction writers actually say that he can be quite sexist at times, and I take that criticism because I think I think it's, without defending it, I don't think it can perhaps be defended. But when you read other science fiction writers, it's comparable. And actually, I would say that Phil Dick wasn't quite as bad in that regard as some of the writers from the 50s that you read. So, you know, I think the thing is, you've got to read any writer in context. And in context, in the fifth, you just got to make allowances for that. And in context, he was and still is incredibly prescient. I mean, I just think the world, the social media, the post-truth stuff, I mean, it's all there and it's right.
We live in a Phil Dickian world, you know, and he was so on the ball in so many things. His politics, his awareness that America had the potential to become a fascist state, his concerns over that, and that's happening now.
Yes, absolutely. It's all in there, and AI deep fakes. I wonder often what Phil Dick would think if he could be resurrected and see the world as we live in. I think
yeah, he would. Absolutely.
Okay, well, let's wind that up. Well, thank you so much, Anthony. It's been such a fascinating chat, and I think it's been on my wish list for a long time to have a big sort of, frankly, sort of fan chat about Philip K. Dick, but also integrating it with your ideas and your work. I think that's been very valuable, and I think it's a crucial spin on the Philip K. Dick story. So, many thanks for coming on the show.
And Matt, thank you very much for inviting me, and we must meet up again soon. We've got lots to talk about.
Absolutely.
As usual. Okay, then.
Thank you. What Lies Beyond with your host Matt Coburn. Conversations on consciousness science, the paranormal and the post-material future. This podcast accompanies the What Lies Beyond book by Matt Coburn, now available for purchase on Amazon and other retail outlets. Visit us and subscribe on whatliesbeyond.substack.com.